The year was 1979. Cambodia lay in ruins. The Khmer Rouge had fallen, driven out by the Vietnamese invasion, but what remained was not peace, it was a land of ghosts. Cities were emptied shells, rice fields had become mass graves, and families wandered aimlessly, searching for scraps of food, for lost children, for safety that seemed forever out of reach. Across the border to the west lay Thailand. Too many Cambodians, the line that divided the two countries, shimmered like the edge of salvation. If they could just cross, they thought, they might live. But the border was not a sanctuary, it was a trap. Minefields, barbed wire, and soldiers turned desperate flight into another theater of horror. This is the story of those who fled death, only to be pushed back into its arms. A story of survival, betrayal, and the haunting cruelty of history. Part 1. No Man's Land. The collapse of the Khmer Rouge in early 1979 was not a single moment of liberation. It was chaos. When the Vietnamese army swept into Phnom Penh in January, the soldiers of Pol Pot scattered into the forests and mountains, dragging civilians with them as human shields. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the nightmare of the killing fields cracked open. But what came next was an even harsher reality. Survival in the ruins of a nation. Cambodians were skeletal shadows of their former selves. Survivors emerged from labor camps where they had been starved and overworked, their bodies wasted and eyes hollow. They walked barefoot across roads that were littered with bones, past villages where not a single soul remained alive. Hunger gnawed at every step. The Vietnamese occupation meant the end of Pol Pot's tyranny, but for ordinary Cambodians, it meant yet another war zone. Vietnam had its own interests: strategic dominance over Cambodia, installation of a puppet regime, and for survivors, the countryside became a battlefield once again. In the east, the Vietnamese army hunted Khmer Rouge guerrillas. In the west, chaos reigned. Tens of thousands of civilians began moving toward Thailand, hoping to escape both famine and war. They walked in columns, men, women, the elderly, children, clinging to their mothers' sarongs. Many carried nothing but a sack of rice or a bamboo basket of rags. They walked without knowing what awaited them. For them, Thailand was not an enemy, it was hope. But hope was fragile. The border was not open. It was mined, fenced, and guarded by Thai troops, wary of the flood of refugees. Thailand, shaken by its own fears of communism, did not want to absorb hundreds of thousands of starving Cambodians. To Thai authorities, these were not simply survivors, they were a burden, a security risk, and perhaps even a political weapon. By mid-1979, the flow of refugees became a tide. Reports described desperate columns stretching for miles, pushing west through the forests of Battambang and Pursat provinces, stumbling across abandoned fields and rivers until they reached the invisible line that divided Cambodia from Thailand. For many, that line was death itself. The land between Cambodia and Thailand was scarred with danger. Minefields, planted years earlier during wars between Thai, Cambodian, and Vietnamese forces, lay hidden beneath the soil. Each step could trigger an explosion. Survivors told stories of families walking together when suddenly one child disappeared in a flash of fire, torn apart by a mine. Others described nights of terror when border guards fired into the darkness to force them back. The journey to Thailand was not an escape. It was a gamble. At Aranyu Prathat, one of the main crossing points, thousands pressed forward. The Thai army tried to hold them back, setting up makeshift barriers, pointing rifles at emaciated civilians, but starvation drove people to keep walking. Some soldiers allowed small groups through, herding them into barbed wire camps. Others forced entire families back into Cambodian territory, toward regions still patrolled by the Khmer Rouge. It was as if fate itself was mocking the survivors' escape, one executioner only to fall into the hands of another. For those trapped in the in-between zone, life was misery. No Man's Land was exactly that. Land belonging to no one, cared for by no one, yet filled with thousands of human beings. With no shelter, families built huts from scraps of bamboo and plastic sheets. Water was scarce. People drank from muddy streams, often contaminated. Disease spread quickly: cholera, malaria, dysentery. Starvation was constant. Children cried through the night, their stomachs swollen from hunger, their ribs jutting out like cages. Some of the survivors who reached Thailand thought they had finally made it to safety. They were herded into camps like Sakao, hastily built in the summer of 1979. But these camps were not havens. They were overcrowded, undersupplied, and plagued by sickness. International aid organizations were slow to arrive, and when they did, the numbers overwhelmed them. Thousands of Cambodians died within sight of food, warehouses, and medical tents. Still, there were worse fates. Many never made it that far. Some were pushed back by Thai soldiers, loaded onto trucks, and dumped directly into minefields. One of the most infamous incidents came at Phra Vihear, where thousands of refugees were forced down a steep cliff back into Cambodia. Survivors recall soldiers beating them with rifle butts, shouting orders in a language they did not understand. At the bottom lay minefields and Khmer Rouge fighters waiting to seize the weak and starving. The cliff became known as a place of screams, where families were shattered in seconds. Why did Thailand do this? To understand, one must see the politics of 1979. Thailand feared both Vietnam and communism. When Vietnam occupied Cambodia, Thai generals saw it as a threat to their sovereignty and influence. Accepting massive numbers of Cambodian refugees, in their eyes, meant importing instability, spies, and political pressure. Pushing survivors back served two purposes: reducing the burden on Thailand and ensuring that Cambodia remained Vietnam's problem, not theirs. But to the refugees, politics meant nothing. They had no country, no army, no power. They were simply trying to live. Mothers carried infants too weak to cry, hoping to find a sip of milk or a grain of rice. Elderly men collapsed along the road, their children forced to abandon them or risk dying together. Survivors who managed to cross into Thailand often described the same haunting image. The road behind them was littered with corpses, some still clutching each other, as if holding on even in death. This was the paradox of 1979. The Khmer Rouge had fallen, but the suffering of Cambodians had not ended. Instead, it shifted, transformed, and took new shapes. The genocide was over, but the nightmare of displacement, starvation, and betrayal had just begun. And in the borderlands, where the green jungles of Cambodia met the dry earth of Thailand, history carved one of its darkest chapters. The world would eventually learn of the Cambodian crisis. Journalists documented the skeletal refugees, the mothers crying over lifeless infants, the soldiers driving families away at gunpoint. Aid organizations called it one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. But in those first months of 1979, there was little comfort for the thousands trapped between minefields and rifles. They were survivors of genocide, yet once again, they were being pushed to the edge of death. For Cambodia's survivors, the border was not a gateway to safety. It was a wall. Behind them lay the killing fields. Ahead of them lay the hostility of a foreign army. And in between stretched the barren earth of no man's land, where hope itself seemed to die. Part 2. The Pushback. The border between Cambodia and Thailand in 1979 was not just a line on a map. It was a battlefield, a place where politics, fear, and survival collided. For the Khmer Rouge survivors staggering westward, it was the edge of existence. For the Thai military, it was a barrier they were determined to guard, even if it meant turning back tens of thousands of desperate people into the very jaws of death they had fled. This act of cruelty, now remembered as the Pushback, remains one of the darkest episodes of Southeast Asia's modern history. The Pushback did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded in waves, across different stretches of the border, in different camps, and under different commanders. But the principle was always the same. Thailand would not let Cambodia's survivors find safe haven. Instead, the refugees were to be redirected, turned back, and in many cases, physically pushed into danger. The scenes that unfolded shocked international aid workers and journalists who bore witness, though the full truth would take years to emerge. At first, the refugees came in scattered groups. A few families would stumble into Thailand near Eronuprathet or Trat, begging for food or shelter. Thai border patrols, unsure how to react, often detained them in makeshift holding areas. But by mid-1979, the trickle had become a flood. Entire villages of survivors, gaunt from famine and terror, poured across the forests of western Cambodia. Tens of thousands reached the border in waves. The Thai military, overwhelmed and fearful, resorted to force. One of the most infamous sites was Preah Vihear, a cliff-top temple along the Thai-Cambodian border. In June 1979, more than 40,000 Cambodian refugees sought shelter near the temple grounds, believing they had crossed into safety. But the Thai army had no intention of allowing them to stay. Soldiers surrounded the crowd, herded them together, and marched them toward the cliff. Survivors would later testify to being beaten with rifle butts, screamed at in Thai, and driven forward at bayonet point. What lay below the cliff was not safety, it was a steep drop into Cambodia, a land scarred by minefields and patrolled by Khmer Rouge remnants. As the soldiers forced people downward, panic broke out. Families clutched each other, trying not to be separated. Mothers screamed for their children. Men tried to resist, only to be struck down. Those who slipped on the rocks tumbled helplessly into the abyss. Others were crushed by the mass of bodies pressing against them. When the refugees finally reached the bottom, they found themselves in a deadly minefield. Explosions ripped through the crowd. Survivors described the ground trembling with detonations, bodies torn apart in an instant. This pushback at Preah Vihear became a symbol of cruelty. International journalists who later arrived recorded horrifying testimony. Entire families had been annihilated, their blood staining the stones of the ancient temple. Aid workers counted thousands who never returned. For those who survived, the images never faded: the screams, the blasts, the sight of loved ones disappearing into clouds of smoke. But Preah Vihear was not an isolated event. All along the Thai-Cambodian border, similar tragedies unfolded. At Eronuprathet, refugees who managed to cross into Thai soil were loaded onto military trucks, driven a short distance, and dumped back across the line into mine-infested fields. The practice was so systematic that survivors gave it a name: deportation to death. One man later told reporters how his family was forced off a truck and made to walk into a dense forest. Within minutes, a mine exploded, killing his younger brother. The Thai soldiers did not stop, did not look back. The brutality shocked the outside world, but to Thai generals, it was cold strategy. Thailand, in 1979, was caught in a web of paranoia. The Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia was seen as a direct threat to Thai sovereignty. Refugees, therefore, were not viewed as victims of genocide, but as potential infiltrators, spies, or pawns in Vietnam's game. By forcing them back, Thailand hoped to shift the burden of crisis onto its enemy. The Thai military's policy also had another unspoken motive. It pushed survivors into zones controlled by the Khmer Rouge. The irony was grotesque: people who had escaped Pol Pot's killing fields were being forced back toward the very organization responsible for their suffering. But geopolitics played its hand here. The Thai government, alongside China, and even tacitly supported by the West, tolerated the Khmer Rouge as a bulwark against Vietnam. This meant that Cambodian civilians, once again, became pawns in a war of influence. For the survivors themselves, the pushback was not politics, which terror repeated. Mothers remembered clutching their children as soldiers shouted at them to move forward, rifles pointed at their backs. Some described moments when their infants slipped from their arms during the chaos, vanishing into the crowd or falling into ravines. Old men stumbled and were trampled. Families were separated in the confusion, some ending up in Thailand, others back in Cambodia, never to be reunited. Those who managed to survive the pushback often wandered into the grasp of Khmer Rouge guerrillas. The rebels, weakened but still dangerous, seized refugees to replenish their ranks. Children were forced to carry weapons, women were conscripted as porters, and men were compelled to fight. Thus, the pushback did not just kill it, recycled human lives into the machinery of war. Survivors who thought they had escaped genocide found themselves once again prisoners of history's cruelty. International aid organizations slowly became aware of the scale of the crisis. By late 1979, the camps inside Thailand Ko, Khoi Dang, and others were bursting with refugees. Yet countless more remained trapped outside, unable to cross because of the Thai army's brutal enforcement. Doctors Without Borders and the International Committee of the Red Cross condemned the pushbacks, calling them a violation of human rights. The United Nations pleaded with Thailand to open its borders fully, but the Thai generals resisted, continuing their policy of selective admission mixed with violent rejection. Journalists who smuggled themselves into the border regions published haunting images: skeletal men carrying children too weak to walk, women weeping as they dug shallow graves for loved ones killed by mines, lines of exhausted refugees marching under the guns of Thai soldiers. These reports brought global outrage, but the reality on the ground did not change quickly. For the survivors, each day remained a question of whether they would eat, whether they would find shelter, whether they would see another sunrise. The cruelty of the pushback was not just in its violence, it was in its betrayal of hope. Survivors walked hundreds of kilometers through jungles, starvation, and fear, clinging to the belief that across the Thai border lay safety. To reach the line, to glimpse the soldiers, only to be turned back into the jaws of death, that was a cruelty few could put into words. Some survivors later said it was worse than Pol Pot's fields, because at least under the Khmer Rouge, they had known their enemy. Here, they had thought they had found salvation, only to be cast away like shadows. Children carried the memories longest. Decades later, many recalled the sights of the pushback with clarity: the thunder of explosions, the cries of mothers, the smell of burning flesh. They remembered Thai soldiers as faceless men with rifles, pushing them toward death. For them, the border was not a line of safety, it was a scar. The tragedy also reshaped Cambodian identity. In 1979, the nation was already broken by genocide, but the pushback showed survivors that their suffering was not isolated, it was dismissed, exploited, even weaponized by neighbors and global powers. To be Cambodian at that moment was to exist as a refugee, a victim not just of the Khmer Rouge, but of the cold indifference of the world. By late 1979, international pressure grew strong enough that Thailand eased its harshest measures. Camps were expanded, and aid supplies began to flow. Yet the memory of the pushback could not be erased. Thousands had died in minefields, cliffs, and forests because they were denied sanctuary. Thousands more were captured again by the Khmer Rouge, prolonging their suffering. The pushback was not just a policy, it was a wound inflicted on people who had already been scarred beyond recognition. To this day, survivors carry the memory. In Cambodian villages, elders tell stories of that year, the year when the killing fields ended, but the cruelty of the world continued. They tell their grandchildren of the march to the border, of the soldiers' guns, of the explosions in the night. They remind them that survival came not from mercy, but from enduring the unimaginable. And for history, the pushback stands as a reminder. Borders can be as deadly as wars, and the cruelty of states can match the cruelty of tyrants. In 1979, Cambodia's survivors discovered that even after genocide, the world still had room for betrayal. Part 3: Pushback into Thailand. Between death and despair in early 1979, the Cambodian landscape was covered in silence and ruins. Villages were emptied, fields were abandoned, families were scattered. The Khmer Rouge regime, once feared as untouchable, had collapsed under the weight of the Vietnamese invasion. But for ordinary Cambodians, liberation did not mean safety. It meant another journey into uncertainty. Thousands of survivors, weakened by hunger and years of forced labor, began moving west. Their only thought was survival. Their only hope was Thailand. The border between Cambodia and Thailand became a line of desperation. Survivors walked through forests and hills. Many carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. Mothers held children too weak to cry. Elderly people leaned on sticks, moving step by step. The dream was simple: to cross into Thailand, to find food, to escape the shadow of the Khmer Rouge. But what awaited them was not mercy, it was rejection. The Thai authorities were overwhelmed. By late 1979, the streams of refugees turned into floods. Camps appeared along the border, some organized by humanitarian groups, others makeshift and chaotic. But Thailand feared being swallowed by Cambodia's tragedy. The government worried about security. It feared infiltration by Khmer Rouge soldiers hiding among the civilians. It feared being burdened with hundreds of thousands of starving people. So Thailand chose a harsh response: push them back. The first pushbacks were brutal. Refugees who had managed to cross into Thai territory were loaded onto trucks. They thought they were being taken to safety. Instead, they were driven to remote stretches of the border and forced to walk back into mined hills and dense jungle. Many had no idea they were being led to death. At Preavir, at the edge of a steep escarpment, refugees were forced down cliffs toward Cambodian territory. Some slipped, some were shot. Many died on the minefields below. For the survivors, despair deepened. They had escaped Pol Pot only to face new terrors. Hunger stalked them. Landmines exploded beneath their feet. Thai soldiers blocked their path. In camps, disease spread quickly. Refugees were not welcomed as victims. They were treated as burdens. One survivor later recalled, "We thought Thailand was freedom, but they closed the gates. They sent us back to death." Another described the moment of pushback. "We saw the cliffs. We saw the mines. We begged them, but they did not listen. They pushed us with rifles." These voices capture the meaning of despair in 1979. To survive genocide, only to be rejected as human cargo. International aid organizations soon raised alarms. Images of starving Cambodians shocked the world. Reports of forced returns reached Western capitals, yet politics complicated everything. The Cold War still framed decisions. The West, hostile to Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia, saw the refugees not only as victims, but also as political symbols. Supporting the refugees meant weakening Vietnam's control. At the same time, silence over Thai pushbacks meant preserving a strategic ally. The result was a humanitarian tragedy hidden behind diplomatic caution. Thailand itself was divided. Some Thai officials demanded stricter pushbacks, fearing endless waves of refugees. Others allowed aid groups to build camps along the border. Humanitarian corridors appeared, but they were fragile. At times, the army closed them. At other times, they reopened. Refugees lived with constant uncertainty. They never knew if they would wake up in safety or be forced back across the line. Life in the camps was harsh. Overcrowding was unbearable. Food was never enough. Disease struck the weakest. Children died in large numbers. Many adults were too exhausted to bury the dead. The camps were not sanctuaries. They were holding zones where despair became routine. People feared both the Khmer Rouge lurking nearby and the Thai soldiers who could expel them at any time. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors carried memories of mass killings, starvation, and forced labor. Yet they were denied the comfort of stability. Every sound of a truck, every call from soldiers, sparked panic. Would this be another pushback? Would they be forced again into the minefields? Fear became part of daily survival. And yet, amid this despair, human resilience appeared. Families shared scraps of rice. Monks held small ceremonies for the dead. Aid workers, though limited, brought moments of relief. A bowl of porridge, a medical kit, a blanket. For survivors, these small gestures meant the difference between life and collapse. The pushback of 1979 was not only a physical event, it was also symbolic. It revealed the abandonment of those who had already lost everything. To be pushed back meant to be told that your suffering did not matter, that your death was acceptable in the balance of regional politics, that your life was less than the weight of security concerns. For many Cambodians, this wound never healed. In the hills and forests of the border, bodies lay unburied. Families were torn apart in the chaos of forced returns. Children were lost. Parents disappeared. Survivors who managed to re-enter Thailand often carried scars. Some lost limbs to mines, others lost hope altogether. Historians now look at 1979 as a year of both liberation and betrayal. Liberation from the Khmer Rouge, betrayal at the border. The refugees were caught between two powers, Vietnam, which had overthrown Pol Pot, but occupied Cambodia, and Thailand, which feared the refugee waves, but also used them as a political weapon. The survivors had no power. They were pawns in a game far larger than themselves. The despair of 1979 still echoes today. Many survivors recall that year as the darkest after Pol Pot, not because of executions in labor camps, but because they were so close to safety, yet denied it. They described the border as a line between hope and death, a line they were forced to cross again and again. This tragedy also shaped Cambodian memory. The pushback became a story passed down through families. It became a reminder of how survival is not always enough. To survive genocide is one thing. To be rejected afterward is another wound, harder to explain, but equally deep. By the end of 1979, international pressure began to change Thailand's approach. Camps became more structured, aid increased, but the scars of the pushbacks remained. They marked that year as a chapter of abandonment, a moment when Cambodia's survivors were trapped, not only by war but by despair itself. The story of 1979 is not only about refugees, it is about human dignity. It asks a haunting question. How can the world allow people who escaped mass killing to be sent back into death? The answer lies in the politics of fear, the calculations of power, and the silence of those who chose not to intervene. For the survivors, despair was real, death was close, safety was denied, and yet they walked on, step by step, across borders, through minefields, into camps, holding on to life even when the world pushed them away. 1979 remains a scar in Cambodian history, a reminder of despair, a reminder of resilience, a reminder that survival itself is not always enough.